I'm Dr. Paul Kosmetatos. I lecture in economic history at the University of Edinburgh. And today I'm going to talk about the failure of Paterson's whiskey, a whiskey blender in Leith in the late Victorian era. On the 3rd of December 1898, Paterson's Whiskey, an established family blending business in Leith, stopped payment just over 2 years after it had floated the minority of its share capital to the public. The company's shareholders and the receivers brought in to manage its affairs initially expected this to be a minor liquidity crisis of an otherwise robust business with valuable assets, which included parts of Glenfarclas and Oldmore distilleries, Duddington Brewery in Edinburgh, and a number of bonded warehouses in prime Leith locations. The company's claims of over 50 years of operation as a major wine merchant and the fact that its auditors had given it a clean bill of health only days before its stoppage supported this initial sense of optimism. Very soon, however, the receivers found themselves facing a tangled web of false claims about the pedigree and assets of the business, together with substantial and occasionally clever accounting fraud that would eventually see the two Pattison brothers convicted in 1901. The company had in fact entered the whiskey business only in 1882, expanding on a modest provisions retail operation established by the patriarch of the family, Walter Gray Pattison. Even before his death in 1890, however, the real driving force for the expansion of the company was his eldest son, Robert Patterson Pattison, who more or less single-handedly managed the business all the way to its bitter end. The elder Pattison was in fact a mere creditor of the new partnership, while his younger son, Walter Gilchrist Gray, played only a peripheral role, although enough for one to eventually see him sent down to prison as well. Even while the business was still only a private partnership, Robert Pattison was already crossing over to fraud. The firm's ledgers show that as early as 1892 he was inflating the stated annual profits of the partnership by as much as £40,000. The accountants investigating the firm's later collapse speculated that this was done on purpose with a view to an eventual flotation. The inflation allowed the share offer prospectus in 1896 to describe a company in robust health, with steady and rising earnings on top of its undeniable excellent assets. The fraud continued and expanded during the 2.5 years of the public company's life. At the end, the receivers and criminal investigators who were brought in calculated the discrepancy between stated and actual assets at over £500,000. The Pattisons had double-booked whiskey sales, omitted whiskey purchases from the books altogether, and overvalued the stocks held in their bonded warehouses. In the latter case, they not only inflated the valuation prices of their various holdings, but went as far as vatting large quantities of inferior whiskey, not with a view of selling it to the public, but to merely christen it an Glenlivet blend that justified a high book valuation. Robert Pattison was also alleged to have turned a £40,000 loan from the Clydesdale Bank over to his private purposes. Even when looked in isolation, this failure forms an interesting case study of corporate malfeasance and failure at the turn of the 20th century, which highlights the problems of transitioning a family business into a public corporation, and serves as a cautionary tale for outsiders investing into a prestige business hitherto dominated by a small number of regional insiders. There are also wider issues potentially at work here. The very fact that the Pattison brothers were able to perpetuate their fraud within a tightly knit business community that depended on close and ongoing creditor relationships poses the question of how and why they turned to fraud. Even after the scandal broke, former employees of the firm giving sworn testimony uniformly presented Robert Pattison as an able and capable businessman with a good grasp of all the business of the firm. Even the accountants who eventually uncovered the fraud admitted that up to 1890 there was no evidence of wrongdoing, and that the Pattisons' personal drawings from the business were, initially at least, by no means excessive. The investigators hinted at a premeditated fraud against the investing public, perhaps put in motion as early as 4 years before the company was even floated. But this might have been a desperate attempt by a company manager faced with a sudden downturn of business to temporarily smooth a bad patch and thus save the work of 2 generations of the family. There are some circumstantial hints for this so-called anomie strain narrative being at least plausible in principle. The years 1890 to 1895 were ones of recession for the whole of the British economy, and the liquor trade in particular may have been affected by the end of the phylloxera epidemic in continental Europe. The same recovery of French vineyards in the early 1890s notoriously led to a sudden glut in the blackcurrant market, which in turn knocked the bottom out of the fragile Greek economy and directly led to one of the country's many and recurrent bankruptcies in 1893. In such a narrative, Robert Pattinson may have sown the seeds of his own destruction by nerdily fiddling with the books, by intending the £150,000 of the share sale proceeds to fill this early accounting hole, as much as to finance the firm's continuing expansion. Now, this expansion is an undeniable fact, though at the time it was not necessarily viewed as reckless. In the decade preceding the company's collapse, its staff had grown from about a dozen to over 50, while their counterparts in London were a mere 6, even at this latter date. At the same time, sales had risen by a factor of 6, with over 600 customers in the books. The same testimony who described Robert Pattinson as able, though misguided, also insisted that the business was prosperous at least until 1890, and its rapid growth legitimate until at least 1895. They insisted that even taking account a number of forced sales towards the end of 1895, the firm had undoubtedly at the time a large business connection. Its substantial and valuable assets aside, Pattinson's Whiskey was also a very innovative company, as is showcased by its aggressive and pioneering advertising campaigns. The case of parrots trained to shout campaign slogans and given away to pubs is the best known of these, but Pattinson's were also very prominent in their press advertisements, which, like modern whiskey advertisements, make much of Scottish imagery, only in this case military rather than Celtic or Viking, as is the case nowadays. Scotland, for so long an object of suspicion to the prospective English customers, was now presented as a mainstay of Britain's imperial zenith, the source of brave soldiers who avenged Gordon at Khartoum, and with world-beating products that were forging ahead, like the popular ironclads of the Royal Navy. In the end, was this an overextension of a business that was ahead of its time, or did Pattison suffer the plain bad luck of expanding just as the bottom was about to fall off the Scotch whisky business? It is very possible that the Pattison's ambitious vision fell victim to unfortunate timing. The reported forced sales in 1895 and the poor profitability of the private partnerships between 1892 and 95 may hint to the Pattisons being victims of the undisputed recession of the early 1890s, rather symptoms of the conventional bubble cycles rather than causes of it. Without a doubt, the final acts of the company's rise and demise came at the heel of a boom in Scotch whisky exports to England, but just before the start of a severe and prolonged contraction in the alcoholic beverage business in the first decades of the 20th century. It is tempting to place Pattison's at the cusp of a Kindleberger bubble and crash narrative, but making it the spark that set fire to the mine of an injudicious expansion in the whiskey business. This was something that was noticed even at the time, even outside the narrow confines of the Scottish business community. The official Inland Revenue Statement from 1900 cautioned that the growth of the distilling industry, though based on long-term positive fundamentals like the growing taste for matured spirits, had been probably carried out at a pace that could not be indefinitely maintained. According to this bubble narrative, therefore, the whiskey industry took advantage of two fortuitous developments. Firstly, a 10% rise in excise duty in 1860 that incentivized keeping spirits in bond and led to increased stocks of matured spirits. Secondly, the aforementioned phylloxera epidemic that devastated continental vineyards and which reduced the imports of French brandy, hitherto the mature spirit of choice for the English middle and upper classes, to a mere trickle. Matured Scotch whisky could therefore step in and replace brandy with a product that was plentiful, affordable, and thanks to the mass production of neutral grain spirits from the newly developed patent still, of a consistent and uniform quality that could be branded and promoted to the new middle classes in England. In the last decade of the century, however, the end of the phylloxera scourge, which at least restored wine imports, if not brandy ones, together with the growth in power of the influential temperance movement, had already prepared the ground for a rapid contraction of this demand. A series of excise duty hikes in 1900 and especially in 1909 were the pricks that let the air out of this bubble. There are problems with this neat narrative, however. Firstly, the timing of the supposed boom and bust phases are out of phase with the wider economy. The supposed boom took place during a time of recession, while the bust occurred while the economy was about to embark in a last growth jump before the disaster of the First World War. The late Victorian era, as a matter of fact, provided rather infertile ground for the growth of asset bubbles, being notorious as a period of sustained deflation, and often referred to as the late Victorian Depression. This is reflected in the figures for credit growth, usually a good indicator for Kindleberger-like bubbles. Though credit certainly grew, especially so in the second half of the decade, it was merely to revert to long-term trends after the recession of the first part of the 1890s. And Scottish credit in particular, which could be expected to impact the whisky industry the most, was almost subdued by comparison to what was happening in England at the time. This is part of ongoing research that even now is at an early stage. It is especially interesting to see how the fraud could be perpetuated for such a long period in such a comparatively small business world. As a financial historian, I inevitably gravitated towards financial records before anything else. So the next step for me is to investigate the relationship of the firm with the Clydesdale Bank. Hopefully, this will be reflected in the bank's outgoing letterbooks. The firm's correspondence with its counterparts in the whisky industry is another possible route. A glimpse of this can be found in the liquidation papers held in the National Records of Scotland, where some of the civil cases against the company can still be found. And some reference exists in the archives of the then Distillers Company Limited, today's Diageo, as reported in Ronald Weir's seminal book on the company. A final direction is to investigate the shareholder demographics of the company and to determine how wide a range of investors were attracted by the company's prospects, and therefore whether the purported whisky bubble was a phenomenon with broad influence or whether it mostly affected the small world of the regular participants in the Scotch whisky industry. Thank you very much.